G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with part 5 of the book review of The Biggest Estate on Earth, How Aborigines Made Australia by Bill Gammage. Published 2011 by Allen and Unwin, ISBN number 9781742377483. Part 1 of the book review, we looked at the landscape and the templates which tens of thousands of years of controlled interlocking fire regimes had burnt into the landscape of Australia. Part 2 of the book review, we looked at the dream time, Aboriginal theology. Part 3, we looked at the Aboriginal concept of country. Part 4, we looked at how land was managed, with fire being the closest ally. Taking us from page 157 to 185, where I was reading some Aboriginal words pertaining to fire. And they were pretty good, so I'm going to start part 5 where I left off at the end of part 4. Slight overlap. Words embraced fire. Darling people used the same word for, quote, flame, quote, open country, and, quote, flame whereby open country is made. Yan Yua say, Ngaraki, quote, badly burnt country, Waterman, quote, well burnt country good to hunt on, and Rumul Maranjara, quote, lighting small fires in a row to burn a beachfront or a large plain. West Arnhem Landers say, and Birulu Yarawad, for, quote, low creeping fires, Ariwalhurj, quote, cleaning the country, Wurruga, quote, burnt ground, and Angold, quote, green pick. Martu speak of Nyurunma, bracket, freshly burnt area, Waru Waru, quote, green shoot stage, Muraka, quote, mid stage, Mangold, quote, mature spinifex, and Karnataka, old spinifex dying in the centre, burn in winter with the right wind and use it to hunt or track on the burnt ground. All that in one word. While Piri say, Wajirika, vegetation which grows following rain, and Yukuri, green vegetation, new growth, time of the year immediately following rains. Perth people said, Boikt, quote, ground clothed with vegetation which has not yet been burned. Narik, quote, unburned ground but ready for burning, land of which vegetation is abundant and dry, fit to be set on fire. Yanbat, quote, ground where vegetation has been burnt. Nepal, quote, burned ground, ground over which fire has passed, free from all scrub and grass. And Kundul, quote, young grass springing up after the country has been burned, the seed of any plant. None of these words have an English equivalent. None describe random fire. All reflect ingrained familiarity with fire, plant cycles. Near Perth, Kalla meant, quote, fire. A fire, figuratively, an individual's district. A property, inland. Kalla took fire into the intimate centre of how people lived, blending heart and soul with country. 5 features marked 1788 fire. It was planned, it was precise, it could be repeated, hence predicted. It was organised locally and it was universal. Like songlines, it united Australia. People accepted its price. They must be mobile, constantly attendant, and have few fixed assets. In return, they could ration its feed, unleash it but never free it, and move it about, sustaining more diversity than any natural fire regime could conceivably maintain. It was scalpel more than sword, taming the most fire-prone country on earth to welcome its periodic refreshing, its kiss of life. Far from today's safe and unsafe fires, campfire and bushfire were one. Far from a feared enemy, fire was the closest ally. A few observers glimpsed this. In many important particulars, Kerr realised, Aborigines were responsible for the state of Australia's flora, fauna, soil and water in 1788. There was another instrument in the hands of these savages which must be credited with results which it would be difficult to overestimate. I refer to the fire stick. For the blackfellow was constantly setting fire to the grass and trees. He tilled his land and cultivated his pastures with fire. And Mitchell concluded, fire, grass, kangaroos and human inhabitants all seem dependent on each other for existence in Australia. For any one of these being wanting, the others could no longer continue. But for this simple process, the Australian woods had probably contained as thick a jungle as those of New Zealand or America, instead of open forests. These were sympathetic men, yet neither touched the shattering loss the people of 1788 felt at the land's subsequent mismanagement and destruction. For their alliance with fire was a means, not an end, and only the beginnings of their achievement. Okay, so now we move on to associations. Watching the shores of King George Sound, West Australia burn in October 1791, George Vancouver mused, fire is frequently resorted to by rude nations, either for the purposes of encouraging a sweeter growth of herbage in their hunting grounds, or as tools for taking the wild animals of which they are in pursuit. He may have been the first in Australia to make this thoughtful remark. Perhaps he was also thinking of people in America or Africa whose pre-contact use of fire could be studied with benefit. Grass was the most closely managed community. It grows best in the open. Some land is naturally treeless, chapter 1, so you might expect people to prefer this for grass. They did the opposite. Grass was a crop, deliberately grown on soil, quote, of the richest description, quote, a rich black mould, a mix of ash and compost, now mostly gone. Even resilient perennials were put there. Where no soil was rich, the best available still carried grass. Arthur Phillip walked west from Sydney, quote, over a vast extent of fine meadow ground where trees were at a greater distance from each other than they are in the country round about the settlement. The soil they found was far superior. Northeast of Emerald in Queensland, Henry Turnbull passed through a most splendid open country consisting of plains and downs, plains stretching as far as the eye could reach on one side, and beautiful grassy slopes running down from a long and high range of mountains on the other, with only a tree to be seen every 500 or 600 yards. The whole face of the country was covered with the finest grasses and richest herbage, with wildflowers of every tint and colour. Kangaroos would bound by us in scores at a time, and frequently 10 or a dozen emus would march up to within 30 yards. Settlers sought grass above all. Moored to an export economy, they saw Australia as pasture. Botany Bay's, quote, meadows, unquote, helped Britain select it to settle. Expeditions were told to report good grass, and from 1788 travellers wrote pages about it. They did not find gold for another 63 years, i.e. when the fire management had made a mess of the country and they had no grass to look for. The country itself is superb, Thomas wrote of the Campaspe in Victoria in 1837. The soil very rich and well clothed with grass with very few trees. A great portion is totally devoid of trees. We were indeed enchanted with this country, and well we might, for no art could improve it, either for use nor ornament. Evans was moderately impressed with the Blue Mountains. It had a fine appearance, the trees being thin and the hills covered with pasture to their tops. This range is rather overrun with underwood and larger timber growing thereon, but the sides are as green as possible. Then near Bathurst he enthused over real plains, quote, pasture. Came on a fine plain of rich land, the handsomest country I ever saw, worth speaking of as good and beautiful. The tract of clear land occupies about a mile on each side of the river. The timber around is thinly scattered. I do not suppose there are more than 10 gum trees on an acre. At 3 o'clock I stopped at the commencement of a plain still more pleasing. The soil is exceeding rich and produces the finest grass intermixed with a variety of herbs. The hills have a look of a park and grounds laid out. There is game in abundance. If we want a fish, it is caught immediately. And 3 days later, The grass here might be mowed. It is so thick and long, particularly on the flat lands. The whole excellent good land, and the best grass I have seen in any part of New South Wales. The hills are also covered with fine pasture. The trees being so far apart must be an acquisition to its growth. It is in general the sweetest in an open country. John Howe cast a pastoral eye on the hunter above Jerry's Plains in New South Wales. A country thinly timbered, and for the last hour many acres without a tree on it. One spot, I think, exceeds 50 acres with not 20 trees on it, and very fine ground. It is the finest sheep land I have seen since I left England. Caught a few perch, a great number in the river, the land on both sides very fine, and a great part of it may be cultivated without felling a tree. Even the high land is well clothed with grass and lightly timbered, and though mostly thicker than the low ground, the grass on the low ground equals a meadow in England and will throw as good a swathe. Well, that's pretty much where they used to have first dairy farms and then horse studs, and now they've got an open-cut coal mine to feed the power stations, to make the electricity, to run the refrigerators and the air conditioners, so all the normal people, the tax-paying citizens, they can light fires to make shit go cold, because they're very technologically advanced, so they are. So, dense timber apart, tree distribution had two striking features. First, often trees were few, scattered and without undergrowth. Second, while like some mangroves chose their own ground, remarkably often forests were on poor or stony soil, like ridges and steep slopes. Grass on good soil and trees on poor soil was almost invariable. Oxley commented, "It is a matter for regret that in proportion as the land improves, the timber degenerates." Atkinson stated, "With the exception of alluvial land, good timber is very seldom found upon good land. The fertile plains in the interior are wholly destitute of it. Around Sydney, the best forest lands are invariably thinnest of trees, and in general it will be found that the best lands are least encumbered with timber." So when I was brought up to believe that my white ancestors had worked really, really hard to clear the land with axes and saws, to put their farms on the river flats, and that's why there were trees up the slopes on the poor country on the hills, that's all bullshit. That's how the land was when the Aborigines left it. The vast part of Australia's cleared country under agriculture was like that when the whitefellas showed up. The Aborigines grew their grass on the best soil, and they managed the ridges with trees. They put the trees on the worst soil. It's perfectly obvious once you know what you're looking at, but we didn't know when I was a kid. It was kept from us. In central Tasmania, Robinson found that the Brady Sugarloaf district was frequently burnt by the natives and is fine hunting ground for them. Open plains of good land, free from timber, bounded by grassy hills. It is a delightful country. Arrived at a plain which natives had set on fire, and the trees round the plain were still burning. And Hellier found climax rainforest country. Grassy. The timber found on these hills is in general of fine growth, very tall and straight. Some of it would measure more than 100 feet to the lowest branch. The trees are in many places 100 yards apart. They will not in general average 10 trees to an acre. There are many square miles without a single tree. To describe open country, he used agricultural language. It had a, quote, cultivated and diversified appearance from its having been lately burnt in several extensive tracts, looking fresh and green in those places, and in others so completely covered with fields of blooming heath that it resembled vast fields of clover, divided by shrubs. In a brilliant insight, he suspected their purpose. Quote, "It is possible that the natives, by burning only one set of plains, are enabled to keep the kangaroos more concentrated for their use, and I can in no way account for their burning only in this place, unless it is to serve them as a hunting place." In 1788, people judged that grass needed rich soil more than trees, and moved forest to suit. Being able to do that made almost any plant distribution possible. People moved plant communities to associate their resources. Much grass and few trees was a valuable and extensive association. Batman found Bellarine Peninsula in Victoria excellent and very rich, and light black soil covered with kangaroo grass 2 feet high and as thick as it could stand. The trees not more than 6 to the acre, and those small she-oak and wattle. Most of the high hills were covered with grass to the summit, and not a tree, although the land was as good as can be. The whole appeared like land laid out in farms for some 100 years back, and every tree transplanted. I was never so astonished in my life. A tourist in Victoria noted, everywhere but on these fertile spots, the trees straggle away from each other or form themselves into picturesque clumps, sometimes leaving wide plains untenanted by a solitary shrub, at other times capriciously dotting the expanse as if planted by the art of hand. Rarely do they stand so close as to prevent a free passage between their trunks, so that you may gallop for miles under their shade over hill and dale without meeting any other obstacle other than that caused by fallen timber. In truth, as has often been remarked, an English park with its lawn and scattered trees gives a better idea of the prevailing scenery than anything else. Persuading fire to do that took finesse and persistence. Grass and woodland often alternated along water. This can occur naturally when streams bend into forest on one bank and leave grass on the other, as perhaps east of Darwin, where the Adelaide was, quote, flanked by rich and grassy plains, but each alternate reach wooded on the opposite side. In 1788 it also occurred unnaturally where no bends were. Upper Lachlan Plains ran alternately on each bank and nearly the same size. Opposite to the plains are woodlands. On the Macquarie, quote, park-like country was alternately plain and brush, the soil on both of which was good. Upper Hunter Plains were on alternate sides, the whole distance varying in breadth from 1/2 to 2 miles. Some parts are without timber and others have no more than enhances rather than detracts from their value, with an inexhaustible soil and a natural herbage but little inferior to the most improved English meadows. On good water both banks might be grass. In Queensland, 1829, Lockyer's creek banks were a succession of grassy meadows, singularly level and occasionally so thinly and lightly wooded as scarcely to furnish 2 or 3 trees in the area of an acre. Indeed, in some parts, patches of plain broke upon us without a tree or a shrub for half a mile. In the 1840s, Murrumbidgee flats were, quote, impossible to be finer. Extensive, rich, grassed meadows, with a few clumps of trees, a succession of ornamental parks that would vie with the finest forest lands in the world. In the Mallee east of Angaston, Sturt met a dark and gloomy sea of scrub, but it may be said that there is an open space varying in breadth from half a mile to 3 miles between the Murray Belt and the river. In Ayers Range, Northern Territory, Giles came to a number of native huts. Hear that? Huts, huts, huts. They built huts. They had houses, they had villages. A number of native huts of large dimensions and 2-storied. 2-story huts. In Terra fucking Nullius. Terra Nullius, the English government said it was. Nobody owned this land. They had huts, 2-story huts, in manicured country estates. On each bank of the creek was a strip of green and open ground, so richly grassed and beautifully bedecked with flowers that it seemed like suddenly escaping from purgatory into paradise when emerging from the recesses of the scrubs onto the banks of this beautiful, I might wish to call it stream. Natives had been here very recently. The scrubs were burning not far off to the northwards, in the neighbourhood of the creek channel. Off water too, one forest type might give way within metres to another or to grass. It is a singular character of this remarkable country, Leichhardt observed, that extremes so often meet, the most miserable scrub with the open plain and fine forest land, and the most paralysing dryness with the finest supply of water. In Queensland, Carl Domin found most interesting the contrast between the open forest and vine scrubs. The line of demarcation between them is most distinct, a phenomenon which is unique in the whole world. He saw similar edges in Lancewood Scrub between Jericho and Alpha, with a most decided line of demarcation. Very different forests had parallel sharp-edged associations. He decided that the open forests in all parts of Queensland are not a natural association, but a secondary one, changed through the influence of their Aboriginal inhabitants, mostly by means of bushfires. Sturt nominated 3 inland landscapes. First, plains of considerable extent wholly destitute of timber. Secondly, open undulating woodlands. And thirdly, barren unprofitable tracts. The first almost invariably occur in the immediate neighbourhood of some river. The open forests, through which a horseman may gallop in perfect safety, seem to prevail over the whole secondary ranges of granite and are generally considered as excellent grazing tracts. The barren tracts may be said to occupy the central spaces between all the principal streams. While generally true of the first two in 1788, though not now, this was only partly true of the third. Explorers found both grass and dense timber off rivers. Hume and Hovell met frequent vegetation changes in northern Victoria. Hills north of the Ovens had brushwood, no trees on their north sides, and thick timber on top. North of the Goulburn was 4 or 5 miles of burnt grass. On one side of the creek is a sort of meadow, but the soil being good produces an abundance of fine grass, and the whole, both hills and lowlands, are thinly covered with timber. On King Parrot Creek, after 3 days' solid scrub bashing, sometimes having to walk hundreds of yards on logs, Hovell wrote in exasperation, "To describe this brush or scrub is almost impossible, as it cannot be compared with that is known in the colony. Suffice to say that it is worse than any that is known in it, or worse than any jungle in any other country. We could not see either over or under, nor 2 yards before." They battled on to a small plain. The further we get from the mountains, the more open we find the country, till at last we find the hills almost destitute of trees, and the lowlands but thinly covered also. Hovell's lowlands are now farms, but where untended, his high country is unbroken forest. He and Hume crossed a patterned landscape. Edges. The richest associations were at the edges, where 3 or more plant communities occur in close proximity. In South Australia, Angas crossed at least 2 edges. The country for some distance was now a vile scrub, full of dangerous holes half hidden by brushwood. This scrub terminated as suddenly as it commenced, and we next entered upon an extensive and beautiful country covered with luxuriant grass and studded with trees like a nobleman's park. Here was a country fresh from the hand of nature and complete in its loveliness, with green pastures, shady trees, and wells of pure and limpid water. Belts. People increased the number and convenience of edges by making belts. Grass lanes in timber or timber lanes in grass, width varying from a few metres to several kilometres. Northwest of Fowler's Bay, the scrub between Wanganyah and Ayers Flat, though not of great extent, was most perplexing on account of the numerous openings which tempted the travellers to enter, but which after a while were closed in by impenetrable masses of thicket, proving to be perfect cul-de-sac. Frequently the travellers entered these delusive avenues only to find themselves compelled to turn back and try another, which often proved as bad. That'll be because they were in a wallaby trap. Ciao.